Well, I've been given my cue, so I guess we can start. I want to welcome you to the Wilson Center. I used to hang around here occasionally for a while, so it's fun for me to be back. I want to thank the Asia program and most especially Warren Cohen here on the front row for inviting me to participate in today's event. It was my pleasure to have known Nancy and her husband Warren for many years and to have had a small role in initiating this lecture series. Many of you here today and those watching from elsewhere knew Nancy Tucker as a scholar, a teacher, a mentor, or a friend. We at the Wilson Center also knew her as family. Nancy was a visiting scholar here at the center in the 1990s, and during the last years of her life was a non-residential senior scholar. She was also a frequent speaker at public events here at the center, and a valued advisor and counselor to the Asia program and to the center's Cold War International History program. So Nancy was in fact family, and we were and are incredibly proud of those ties. But that's not the reason we initiated this series in her honor. We wanted to memorialize Nancy because of what she taught us about China and Taiwan and Hong Kong and about U.S. relations, U.S. policy in East Asia. We wanted to memorialize her because she was both a splendid historian and an acute analyst of contemporary policy issues. And we wanted to honor her because she did more than talk the talk. Nancy Tucker walked the walk. Not only was she a first-rate scholar, but twice, on two separate occasions, she entered government service, thereby employing her skills as a historian to help fashion better American policy. Those stints in the policymaking world greatly enriched her scholarship and her teaching. Maybe equally importantly, enabled her to write history that resonated with those who were responsible for the formulation and implementation of policy. I think, for instance, of her book, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the United States, 1945 to 1992, Uncertain Friendships, an historical account spanning nearly half a century, which in 1996 was acclaimed by the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations as the most outstanding book on foreign relations or international history by a female author over the preceding 2 years. Or her two other books focusing specifically on the volatile Taiwan Strait and American efforts to support a good friend in Taiwan while simultaneously maintaining a working relationship with Beijing. I hardly need remind this audience that many analysts and scholars point to tensions in the Taiwan Strait today as the most likely trigger for a truly dangerous crisis between Beijing and Washington. Nancy Tucker spent a lifetime studying American-Chinese, Taiwanese relations. Had she not been taken from us prematurely, her insights and judgments on this tangled triangle would have provided a steadying voice to a discussion that all too often seems driven by polemics, partisanship, and misinformation. All told, Nancy wrote or edited 7 books on U.S. foreign policy. In addition, she regularly published articles and essays in leading foreign policy and history journals and journals devoted to contemporary international affairs. All her work was informed by a profound respect for the facts, by an understanding that facts alone rarely drive decision-making, and by an appreciation of the human element in the conduct of foreign policy. Today, as the United States and China face unprecedented challenges in trying to figure out how to live alongside one another, we miss Nancy Tucker more than ever. We are truly fortunate to have Jacques Delisle deliver the 9th Nancy Bernkopf Tucker Memorial Lecture. Nancy knew and admired Jacques and would have been pleased by his selection as today's speaker. Jacques Delisle is the Stephen A. Kozin Professor of Law, Professor of Political Science, and Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. In addition, he serves as Director of the Asia Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institution, based in Philadelphia. He is an internationally recognized expert on Taiwan, China, and US-China relations, with numerous articles on these and related topics in some of the most highly regarded scholarly and policy journals and in edited volumes. In addition, he has edited himself numerous books on China and Taiwan. Most recently, The Party Leads All, The Role of the Chinese Communist Party in China's Politics, Governance, Society, Economy, and External Relations, published last year. I might also add that Jacques is a frequent collaborator with the Wilson Center and its Asia program, so it's especially nice to have him to be our lecture speaker today. His talk this afternoon is titled Straight to the Point, Current Challenges for Taiwan and US-Taiwan Relations. After Jacques' prepared remarks, Asia Program Deputy Director Shioko Goto will moderate a question and answer session, after which I suspect she will invite you to stay for a reception right next door. Jacques, welcome. The podium is all yours.
Well, thank you, Bob, for that much too kind introduction, and thank you all for coming here today. It's really an honor and a humbling thing to be up here giving the Nancy Bernkopf Tucker lecture. I want to acknowledge Warren Cohen. I don't know if Warren remembers this, but one of the first things I wrote after joining the faculty was a piece in an edited volume on Hong Kong that he edited with Li Zhao. And the issue of Hong Kong actually is what led me into Taiwan issues. Obviously, there's some analogies and some pretty strong disanalogies. But Nancy herself, of course, understood the connection. You heard a reference already to her book, Uncertain Friendships, which was Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the United States. Nancy's writings were part of my initial education in US-China relations and in Taiwan issues, and I blame her for dragging me into this because her work was so compelling and interesting. Years later, one of the real highlights of my 10 years directing the Center for East Asian Studies at Penn was to have Nancy as our distinguished East Asia lecturer, really one of the most memorable moments of that time. I could go on, but I'm supposed to say something substantive, so let me turn a bit to that. You've already heard from Bob about the moment we live in, and it's a moment I really would have liked to have heard Nancy's wisdom about, because these are tough times. Within the last several days, you've of course seen another round of military exercises after Tsai Ing-wen's visit to the United States, a slightly muted version of what happened after Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August, which in turn echoed the third cross-Straits crisis that Nancy and her co-contributors wrote so interestingly and incisively about in the book Dangerous Strait. Xi Jinping has warned that we cannot pass the Taiwan question down from generation to generation. He has told the PLA to have the capacity to take Taiwan if need be by 2027, and some people in US military circles appear to take that date very seriously, and perhaps even a sooner date. Think tanks in this town are spending a lot of time doing war games that include escalations to US-Chinese military conflicts and even nuclear escalation. Less than 2 years ago, The Economist declared the Taiwan Strait to be once again the most dangerous place in the world, and President Biden has repeatedly contemplated the use of US force to defend Taiwan from an unprovoked attack by China. China regularly reminds the world that it will use force if need be to achieve unification or to prevent independence, and it has talked about toughening its anti-secession law, and there was even a brief boomlet about adopting a Taiwan national security law to parallel the one in Hong Kong. Much of that is overheated, so I'm not going to jump on the bandwagon of we're all doomed, but the likelihood of a near-term US-China conflict over Taiwan is low, but it's higher than it used to be, and Taiwan is facing mounting coercion from China in many ways, including economic, political, diplomatic, gray zone, military, and so on. And Taiwan is the most likely trigger or focal point for a US-China conflict. For the US, Taiwan has changed. Its position in US thinking has changed dramatically in the last 15 years, from when Taiwan was seen as the most likely cause of an unnecessary crisis in a basically good US-China relationship, oversimplifying a bit, but to becoming one point of friction in a basically adversarial relationship, such that if one could solve the Taiwan problem, whatever that means, it wouldn't fix US-China relations. And Taiwan even then now appears as a partner and an asset in a community of like-minded states that are engaged in a more and more rivalrous relationship with China. Throughout the post-Second World War period and down to today, Taiwan has depended on external sources, primarily the United States, for its security. It's a relationship that, as Nancy reminds us in her work Straight Talk, has never been an easy one and has been fraught with a good deal of distrust and miscommunication. What I want to focus on today are some aspects of the way Taiwan has negotiated and navigated this difficult arrangement in its quest for security. I'll focus primarily on legal and legal-political approaches here, some of which have broad implications for US foreign policy in the region. Taiwan's been relatively consistent in pursuing the themes that I'll be talking about today, but it has had to adapt to a changing environment, one in which China and the US are the most important shaping factors. And the set of methods that Taiwan continues to pursue today and will likely pursue in the near future faces new, serious, and growing challenges and uncertainties. So the first two dimensions I'm going to talk about are relations with states in the international system. And the first of these is formal diplomatic relations. This matters for a variety of reasons, and here I promise you it's about the only time I'm going to international law nerd out in this discussion. But if you look at the definition of what is a state in international law, and here international law more or less tracks international practice, is you have to have a population, check. You have to have a stable territory. Islands are great for that. You have to have a government that provides domestic order and governance at home, and that can engage in relations with other states. Now, other states is a fraught term in the Taiwan context, but the best indicator of your ability to do that is to maintain formal diplomatic relations. Now, this matters for functional international relations, of course. To put it a little crudely, if you are facing Saddam Hussein in his heyday, wouldn't you rather be Kuwait than the Kurds? More mundanely, diplomatic relations, of course, help keep Taiwan on the stage as a state or near-state player. Think of what we just saw again last week. Tsai Ing-wen was in the US on a transit visit to and from remaining diplomatic allies in Central America. It allows the ROC president to do head of state, head of government-like visits, and to meet with senior officials, politicians, and so on. So what's happened on this front? Well, not so much good news in recent years. Of course, Taiwan's cadre of diplomatic partners has shrunk since the diplomatic truce of the Ma Ying-jeou presidency, 2008 to 2016, ended. Taiwan's now down to 13, Honduras being the latest and most recent of 9 to have dropped relations during Tsai's presidency. And Taiwan is now down to one partner in the developed world in Europe, the Vatican. In Africa, it's got one left. And it's lost some of the biggest by population, recently Panama, and the pressure is on in Paraguay. So lots of concerns there. US policy has been supportive on this front, but it can only go so far. The US issued a mild warning to Honduras about the fool's gold of what China promises in return for establishing diplomatic relations. And when we had the last cluster of defections a couple of years ago, the US recalled, several years ago, the US recalled its ambassadors to the Central American states in question and put some pressure on the Solomon Islands and Kiribati for their switchings or possible switchings of diplomatic recognitions. We see things like the Taipei Act, one of many pieces of legislation passed by Congress that calls for the use of carrots and sticks, basically to reward those states that maintain relations and to take some kind of action against those who break ties with Taiwan. Now, there are, of course, limits. Hypocrisy is a bit of a problem. How do you tell others to do something you're not willing to do and can't do for obvious reasons? And Taiwan knows, everyone recognizes that Taiwan's not going to reestablish formal diplomatic relations with the United States or many other great powers. That all sounds pretty bleak, but let me suggest that this strand is not quite as bad as I probably have made it sound. There is peril ahead here, but it can be limited in a few ways. One is there is growing skepticism around the world, especially among small countries, that better relations with China can be something of a double-edged sword. It creates leverage that can be used against you to political ends. That, however, has been more a phenomenon in the global north than the global south. States in the global south seem less worried about that, and that, of course, is where most of Taiwan's partners are. So we do see states like Lithuania and the Czech Republic upgrading to a degree their relations with Taiwan, but that's, again, a global north thing more than a global south thing. But more importantly, there's no magic number. How many diplomatic relations is too few, where it calls into question your status? I don't know, maybe double digits versus single digits, but we're into angels dancing on the head of a pin territory. And there is a risk to Beijing of this strategy. If it squeezes Taiwan too hard, Taiwan's backed into a corner. When that has happened, sometimes Taiwan has done things that aren't really good for anybody, Taiwan, the US, or China. And the other thing is Taiwan has the opportunity to code switch. Isn't that what the kids call it today? That is, you can stop talking about formal diplomatic relations and say, hey, Taiwan has some of the most robust informal international relations of anyone out there. Just essentially switch to the other type of argument. Which leads me to Taiwan's second strategy. Pursuing strong informal relations with those states, including the United States, that will not or cannot keep formal ties. Why it matters is probably too obvious to say. If I can go back to my international law nerding out, when it says relations with other states, it's not too clear whether that has to be formal as opposed to informal. And of course, the informal relations with the US are what permit the transit stops, the various kinds of support. And the fundamental point here is that the quasi-diplomatic and quasi-alliance relationship with the US is the most important external support for Taiwan's security, so much so that that relationship is the focus of much of the ire from Beijing about foreign interference in China's domestic affairs and the criticism of the US for fomenting secession or independence. So what has happened here? Well, here things have gone relatively well for Taiwan in recent years. In the Ma and Tsai presidencies, we've heard repeatedly, often from both sides, that bilateral relations are the best they've been in decades. And there is a strong and durable underpinning for this in things like the Taiwan Relations Act, basically a set of US laws and policies which set a relatively high floor, although also a not super high ceiling in terms of the bilateral relationship. And basically the TRA, as you all know, was put in place to provide a domestic law substitute for what Taiwan lost with the severing of formal diplomatic ties and the US recognition of the PRC as the government of China. It's the first of many adventures in the as-if world of Taiwan's engagement with the outside world. It mandates, of course, AIT TECRO ties, gives Taiwan sovereign immunity within the US system, and provides one of the underpinnings for the robust informal security relations, including the sale of arms of a defensive character. And of course, most recently, we've seen a further uptick in the last few years. As everyone knows, President Biden has repeatedly spoken of the commitment to being a US commitment to defend Taiwan from an unprovoked attack, and even that Taiwan's future is for people of Taiwan to decide. Some see that as an abandonment of strategic ambiguity or a walking away from the one China policy. I think that too is an overread. It's within the bounds of that space that those vague and malleable policies define, but it is definitely toward the so-called pro-Taiwan end of that spectrum. In Congress, we've seen a lot more action than we've seen in a long, long time. The National Defense Authorization Acts of the last several years, and the alphabet soup of the TTA, the ARIA, the Taipei Act, the Taiwan Assurance Act, basically all of these policies, Taiwan Travel Act, one of them, and provisions of the Taiwan Policy Act, which were folded into the most recent NDAA. These are strong signals of congressional support, and in contrast to what we saw for decades after the TRA, these actually pass, and pass with huge majorities. And the content of them is striking. It calls for higher level government contacts, government-to-government contacts, closer defense cooperation and more arms sales, and support by the US for Taiwan's international space and participation, as well as maintenance of diplomatic ties with its remaining partners. And of course, we've seen some fairly prominent leaders of Congress do some things lately that have gotten a little attention. Pelosi's trip in August, McCarthy's meeting just a few days ago in California. And Taiwan's success on the informal relations front has not been limited to the United States. We've seen striking developments elsewhere, including ties with Japan, which now defines Taiwan as part of its international security interests. We've seen Europe be newly supportive of Taiwan. Partly this is bound up with what's going on in Ukraine and the obvious analogies there, but it also reflects a European souring of the relationship with China and a concern about the political liabilities of economic dependence on China. But in a sort of flip of my earlier point that the deterioration of formal relations is not as bad as it first may look, there is an underside to the relative strength in informal ties. China has pushed back not just against formal independence, which used to be its principal focus, but has increasingly emphasized problems of soft independence, creeping independence, gradual independence. Pick your adjective. It's all about something that Taiwan is trying to sneak by. And I think the charges have gotten louder about how the US is behind this. You've seen Lithuania be punished with sanctions for allowing the Taiwan Representative Office to use the name Taiwan. And you've seen pressure very recently on the European Union for having, and on Europe in general, for having an independent foreign policy, not following the US, or in Macron's terms, not being a vassal of the United States or getting dragged into a conflict that is not Europe's concern, which apparently France as an Indo-Pacific power doesn't think, whatever. The unity within the global north is, unfortunately, easily exaggerated, as that suggests, and it's not just a Europe problem. South Korea and Japan are not on the same page. US allies throughout the region have different views. Let me turn now to the next two elements in Taiwan's repertoire. These are engagements with international organizations and institutions. And you could categorize these a bunch of ways, but for simplicity, two categories. The big deal ones, the UN and its affiliated agencies, the ones that have state member requirements for membership in theory, state status requirements for membership, and then the others. Core UN membership, of course, is not available for Taiwan. The famous UN General Assembly Resolution 2758 of 1971 handed the Chinese seat from the ROC to the PRC and Chiang Kai-shek's forces, I believe they were called, who still claimed unambiguously that they were the one government of China, summarily left. We could have a long discussion about where that leaves Taiwan, but we'll leave that for another day. But the US has a long-standing policy of not supporting UN membership for Taiwan, a position reflected in the Clinton-era 3 no's and in the US's broader one China policy. And of course, the punctuation mark on this, the exclamation point or the stake through the heart, was Chen Shui-bian's ill-fated referendum on his way out of the presidency in 2008 in Taiwan, when the question was, should Taiwan seek to enter the United Nations under the name Taiwan? Referendum failed, a lot of blowback, and one of the focal points of a rare open US critique of what Taiwan was up to in its own domestic democracy. The UN specialized bodies, 15 of them, have been another focus of Taiwan in terms of trying to engage with international organizations. The big success story here for a while was the World Health Assembly, where Taiwan got its annual invitations during the Ma Ying-jeou era. The last invitation sort of straddled the transition from Ma to Tsai, but it hasn't happened since. And while SARS had something to do with the beginning of those invitations, took a few years afterwards, was part of the story, COVID doesn't seem to be having that great an impact, although it has led to stronger calls for allowing Taiwan to again engage. For a hot minute, Taiwan was allowed to attend the International Civil Aviation Organization's Triennial Assembly, got it once, never again. And Taiwan has had some marginal access, usually in technical meetings and as experts, to a variety of other UN specialized agencies and processes. But these have, as that inventory suggests, there have been some losses on this front in recent years. China, again, has blocked Taiwan at the WHA since 2017, despite COVID. And although the global costs of excluding Taiwan have been all too evident, nonetheless, not much budging on that front or any other in the UN system. And in some ways, the UN story has gotten even worse than that cutting off when Tsai became president would suggest. China has been escalating its attempt. I see Bonnie out there, who's part of this project, or with Jessica Drun is terrific on this, that China has been escalating its attempt to say UN General Assembly Resolution 2758 implies UN acceptance of the One China principle, and beyond that implies the international community's acceptance of the One China principle, which in turn means Taiwan can't be anywhere in an international organization space if you accept that reading. And further, as this work has shown, China has even kind of gotten into the files and taken a little liquid paper to the documents and changed the designation to Taiwan Province of China, whereas that was not what it was previously called. And then we get the petty, you can't get into a UN building with a Taiwan passport unless you have a mainland travel card as well. More broadly, we see China pressuring other states and UN institutions to squeeze Taiwan's space. We see China sort of flexing its muscles across a whole range of UN organizations, not always just with respect to Taiwan, but it certainly happens in the Taiwan-related areas, and includes having Chinese nationals at senior positions in a lot of these UN specialized agencies, and essentially in line with their government's preference. The other international organizations, the fourth strand, is an area of greater success. Here, it's still limited, but again, better. So where state status is not required for membership, those kinds of organizations Taiwan does better with. Taiwan also does better if its inclusion in a regime is extremely important for the regime to function. That's what we see in the public health space with WHA. It was one of the arguments for civil aviation and so on, but it happens mostly in the economic space. So where in economic regimes and in public health, again, areas where those things are not so much barriers, some openings. The other way that Taiwan tends to get better engagement with international organizations is where China did not precede Taiwan in joining the organization. So you look at things like the WTO, where technically China got in before Taiwan did, but it was a package deal which conveniently straddled the turnover of the calendar page from 2001 to 2002, so China could say it got in the preceding year. APEC, where China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong all got in simultaneously, or the Asian Development Bank, where Taiwan, the ROC, was in from the 1960s, and China didn't join until its blitz to join international economic organizations in the mid-1980s. There are still nomenclature problems. Chinese Taipei, well-known place, or the separate customs territory of Taiwan, Penghu, Jinmen, and Mazu. That's a nice little stamp. So we see that kind of pressure, but there is at least an opportunity to engage. Now here too, however, we're in a moment where that strategy of joining international organizations, I should add one more dimension here, really not terribly important international organizations have been more open. The International Philately Association or something like that, the International Numismatic something. I mean, these are open, but the farther you get down the list, the easier it is. Although I would point out that states issue stamps and coins, so maybe there's something there. So here too, there's been a negative turn that I think has been building, making it tougher for Taiwan, and it's really got several dimensions. One is China's rising influence within many of these international organizations, replicating what we saw at the UN. Another is that many of the key organizations where Taiwan has had success are becoming less important, less functional. The WTO is broken. The dispute resolution process is broken partly because of the US position on appointing people to the appellate body, and partly because the US has disengaged from some of these institutions, has expressed greater dissatisfaction with them. That was obviously at an apogee or a nadir, depending on how you look at it, during the Trump administration, but it's a more general trend. It's a long story, right? The post-World War II hegemon declines in power, the international institutions don't serve its interests quite as well, it starts to get a little hinky about the things that no longer suit its preferences. But probably the most important development on this front, is the rise of new organizations, so that membership in the old ones doesn't occupy the regulatory space as much as it once did. So the WTO now coexists alongside numerous regional trade agreements, which shrink the WTO's effective governance in that area. Think of ECFA, the Economic Cross-Strait Framework Agreement. That is a Taiwan-China structure that takes bilateral trade relations partially out of direct purview of the WTO. Think of the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a China-centered organization, not entirely China-created, but China-centered, which does not include Taiwan. The new multilateral development banks, World Bank's still out there, ADB's still out there, but now we have the AIIB, which is a largely China-shaped organization, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And we see the US walking away from the TPP So now we have the CPTPP because we don't have enough letters kicking around into space, and the US is not ready to engage, and these are organizations that operate by consensus, which means it's easy for China to have some partner who will keep Taiwan out. Finally, in Taiwan's repertoire is the second as-if dimension. As I said, the TRA kind of is as if the US had diplomatic and security relations with Taiwan. But Taiwan's broader as-if strategy is essentially to behave in the international system as if it were fully a member of a variety of regimes that it's not formally allowed to join. So think of things like the principal human rights treaties, or things like the Law of the Sea Convention. Those are kind of lawyerly things, but they also are important features on the international landscape. And here Taiwan does all the stuff you would do if you were a state member of these institutions, but can't be because the UN won't let you deposit your ratification of the treaties because you're not on the list of governments. And this matters in two ways. One is by behaving as if one is a sovereign state member in good standing of these major international conventions. You again look like a state, a peer of the other members. And it also allows Taiwan to do something else that has been a key part of this strategy, which is playing to the values issues. That is in line with human rights, in line with democracy, in line with a liberal trading order, in line with a liberal order for the seas, all those kinds of things. These all over time sometimes matter, sometimes don't matter so much for an entity's international stature. At the moment, we're in a period when those kinds of values have, at least until recently, been waxing rather than waning. So if you look at human rights, what has Taiwan done? Throughout its democratic era, from Li Denghui to Tsai Ing-wen, Taiwan leaders and their administrations have stressed Taiwan's performance as measuring up to the international human rights standards. Taiwan, again, attempted to submit its ratification documents, and when that failed, still did the kind of things in terms of domestic law reform, and even writing up the reports that you would submit as part of Universal Periodic Review and Covenant-specific review. And even it created a Human Rights Commission, an idea that was launched under Chun, came to fruition under Tsai. These are all, again, acting like a member of the system. Such actions serve to show that Taiwan is engaged in international good citizenship, supporting a rules-based international order and so on, but it also is used as a basis to draw a contrast with the PRC. Human rights records, democracy, all of that looking a good deal better. And so we're in a world where being a state or not being a state still matters a lot, but if you're a state that has a kind of cruddy record on a lot of things that matter on the values stuff, you get lowered a little bit. And if you're not quite a state, you can play this card in your favor, it probably helps. In short, human rights and democracy cred resonates with the always present but unevenly important values theme in US foreign policy and in the foreign policy of some other states. And we've seen some of this come back in the context of the China-Russia versus the US and the global north over Ukraine. And we've seen more broadly the Biden administration re-engage with the UN Human Rights Council after a brief exit for the preceding few years, and a foreign policy agenda that focuses heavily on like-minded states, the Summit for Democracy, and both of which are categories in which Taiwan has been included in US descriptions of those fields. Let me just touch briefly on one other regime, which sounds a little less integral to this, but it's, I think, worth noting in passing, which is the Law of the Sea. You can tell a similar story here where Taiwan has engaged in as-if participation, acting like it's a full member in good standing, and drawing contrast to China. So think of the South China Sea disputes that were the subject of the arbitration with the Philippines a few years ago. Yes, Taiwan asserts sovereignty over a lot of the same stuff that the People's Republic of China does, but Taiwan's statements say we should follow international law in doing this, we should keep the sea lanes and airspace open, and Taiwan submitted its brief to the tribunal that was arbitrating between the Philippines and China. That was rejected. China wouldn't participate, but its brief was in fact accepted. But again, Taiwan is here stressing its conformity to international legal norms and drawing contrasts with China. And this is one where, again, a little complicated because the US hasn't joined that regime, but yeah, that's a topic for another day. Now here too, though, there are, I think, problems to how this strategy plays out in the environment we're facing today. Some of these institutions and norms are under siege and facing erosion, with China and to a degree the US, again, being part of the problem. There's always been a problematic dimension to US support for the international human rights regime. We've long taken the position that our domestic system fully complies, we don't need to make any changes. And US behavior at home and abroad, hardly perfect, And if you're a great power, well, guess what? You get a lot more scrutiny. And that leads to a certain defensiveness when these norms are deployed against oneself. And of course, we saw again the US leaving the Human Rights Council for a time during the Trump administration. But none of this is out of nowhere. These are long-standing features. And the same is true of the law of the sea. The US has long failed to join the UN Convention, and therefore is somewhat weak standing there, giving its critics a great talking point. But China is a bigger part of this story. In principle, China has accepted universal human rights since around 1990, but it has consistently pushed the idea that sovereignty is a human right and that therefore external criticism is problematic. It has pushed for the idea that human rights are relativistic, both by political system and by economic development level and also by culture. And now we see China undermining the Human Rights Council process in the UN by freezing out NGOs and stifling criticism of authoritarian regimes more generally. And again, in what is probably a somewhat overheated analysis, we're seeing more and more discussion of China's attempt to export its model of governance to other states, particularly in the global south. And I go on for a very long time, and I promise I won't, about how the law of the sea regime is one where China's been sort of pushing the envelopes of the world. If I could just throw up the 9-dash line map, it would show you that's a very funny notion of what your waters look like, or of what kinds of maritime rights you get adjacent to tiny little bits of rock, and so on. So both physically and conceptually, China has exerted claims to the South China Sea that are way in excess of what the existing norms allow, and that suggests a sort of subversiveness toward that regime. So not to go too far into all of that, that is to say that in these and other issue areas, Taiwan has tried to portray itself as a good citizen by acting as if it were a member, again, of institutions and regimes it is not allowed fully to join. So as I get near the end of my time here, I want to take a step back and say that everything in that long list of 5 or so tactics that I've been talking about is part of a broader agenda that Taiwan has pursued. And I've hinted at this before, but basically these are multiple elements of a strategy that cohere as an attempt by Taiwan to be, or to seem to be, or to be accepted as something that is a state or very close to a state in the normal sense in the international system. And more specifically, one in good standing by the system's norms, and still more specifically, one supported by the United States. A major reason for doing this, as I mentioned a bit earlier as well, is that being a state is a good thing in terms of security for a vulnerable polity or people. A world that does not do a whole lot about violence or human rights violations within a state, within its territory, think of Xinjiang, think of Tibet, think of Hong Kong, will do something occasionally about state against state action. And it's notable, I think, worth noting, that the world looks away when you see military activity to suppress so-called secession, the attempt to break away from a larger state, and that among the charges that Beijing levels against those in Taiwan, Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong, the so-called independent moves in Hong Kong, is that they are secessionists. Other bad things too, but secession keeps coming up as a linking thread. You can't break up a state. You can't intercede in a state. And the world, again, largely accepts that norm. But the international community will still sometimes rally to deter or defeat the use of force to conquer or take part of the territory of one state by another. This is one of those bedrock features of at least the post-war international order, and indeed back before that in UN Charter Article 2.4 and all that sort of stuff, and the international politics that largely underpins that. And here we've seen, for Taiwan perhaps, at least somewhat positive development in what's happened with Russia-Ukraine. It's heartening to see the rallying against this fundamental breach of a basic norm. And for Taiwan, the fallout of the Ukraine war has meant growing international political support for Taiwan against PRC coercion or bullying. And Taiwan here has adapted its strategy by, I think, playing harder to the security dimension of its relationship with the US and others, and about how the threat to international security that we see by Russia against Ukraine has its echo, its resonance in the cross-Strait situation, portraying Russia and China as one and the same, a sense as authoritarian regimes at odds with the interests as well as the values of fellow liberal democracy. But here too, the story is hardly an unmixed good one, and in many ways, Taiwan faces an increasingly difficult set of circumstances. The Ukraine conflict here, again, is somewhat Janus-faced. Even the fundamental principle to which Taiwan's long and multifaceted legal political quest for security is appealed, that is, state sovereignty, state sanctity, is in trouble. Russia-Ukraine is a big challenge here. And it's likely to be far more destructive and far more enduring and far more challenging to the norm than the closest precedent we have in the post-war era, which is Iraq-Kuwait. And of more immediate relevance here is what the Ukraine war is at least hinting at about how China may be changing its view of state sovereignty. China was long the strongest adherent of state sovereignty as a shield against imperial encroachments and depredations in the 19th century by the West and by Japan, the threat of the Soviet Union and the West during the Cold War. It's not surprising that China's commitment would soften somewhat as China became more secure from foreign threats, and as it developed interests and agendas that would benefit from less deference to other sovereignty. But nonetheless, the commitment to a strong sovereignty norm had persisted for reasons ranging from a diplomatic goal of solidarity with post-colonial countries which felt similar vulnerabilities, to being a useful frame for China's asserting its sovereignty over what it regards as temporarily lost territories that are really Chinese, such as Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, and the bits and pieces of rock out in the South and East China Seas. But the cracks are showing in this view, partly in the dire context of Ukraine. Facing the analogies that many have drawn between Russia-Ukraine and China-Taiwan. So we see China declaring the two cases are fundamentally different in nature, in that Taiwan is an internal matter. There's no element of two states in the China-Taiwan case. But China notably has not embraced the Putin position, right? I mean, you could make this all very consistent. Just as Ukraine isn't a real state and Ukrainians are really Russians, well, Taiwanese are really Chinese and there's not a real state there. But instead, China, with its limitless friendship with Putin and the support that we've seen, has gotten a little soft in the discussion of the sanctity of states and the way it's at least handled, if not always talked about, the Ukraine situation. Although if you go through Chinese statements, the emphasis on Ukrainian sovereignty has faded some over the course of the months that we've been witnessing this. And this softening comes at a moment when China is more generally acting to challenge status quo rules in what the US likes to call the rules-based international order, sometimes flouting them, sometimes reshaping them, sometimes reinterpreting them, sometimes gaining influence in the institutions that shape those rules and define them, and sometimes creating new institutions which at least give China an option of reshaping rules in various issue areas. In other words, behaving like the great power that it clearly has become. In a final pretzel logic twist, in the claim that Taiwan is not like Ukraine, that's one area where Beijing and Washington agree. Taiwan is not like Ukraine. Problem is, how it's not like is a fundamentally different view, right? It's an internal matter versus we will use military internationally to protect against an attack. So the last point brings me full circle. And basically as a reminder of the deadly serious game that Taiwan must continue to play in its quest for security, and the pivotal role of the United States in that game, and the central place of Taiwan and Taiwan-related issues in an increasingly fraught relationship between the world's two greatest powers. The US-Taiwan alignment is relatively close these days, but as Nancy would remind us, it has never been without its frictions, misperceptions, and vulnerabilities. Indeed, one of Nancy's shorter co-written pieces weighed in against one of the many periodic attempts to whether we should abandon Taiwan. That erupts kind of like locusts every 7 years or so. But any number of things can be disruptive of Taiwan's fragile security and of US-Taiwan relations that underpin it, and that reflect US assessments of US interests. So we can imagine further bumps in the road ahead, in addition to the sort of long unfolding ones I've mentioned. Just think about what's going to happen within the next year. Taiwan will elect a new president to succeed the term-limited Tsai Ing-wen in January 2024. We are guaranteed to get someone who is less familiar to Washington, less adept at handling Taiwan's external relations than Tsai and Ma were, at least during their presidency. We'll leave aside Washington's view of Tsai in 2012. We'll leave aside anybody's view of Ma after his little trip to the mainland. But in the period when they were actually in power, they handled it pretty well. In a sense, the US got lucky. And we do have to look forward not only to the question of whether the next president will be fully able to deal with that from the Taiwan side, what that will mean for Washington. We also have to worry about the campaign that precedes that. There's going to be predictably some, if you let the other guys win, we're in big trouble. DPP will lead to war with China. The KMT will lead to sellout to China, either through naivete or duplicity, and so on. And a lot of things can then be cherry-picked by those who want to hyperventilate about the situation. US politics too, we've got an election coming up, and unfortunately our season lasts forever. And there's no real percentage in US politics right now in not bashing China or in thinking really subtly about the cross-Strait problem. And China, too, of course, has its own politics, opaque as they are, that are in some sense of the mirror image of the US is on this. I don't think anybody wins much favor with Xi Jinping and company these days by being soft on America. So these are the sorts of things that also underlay a deeper structural problem, one I won't get into too much here because I am mindful of the time. But basically, the deterrence game toward China, which includes reassuring Taiwan, convincing Taiwan the US is there, and deterring an increasingly powerful and in some ways assertive China, that has become much tougher, and Taiwan's ability to navigate those waters has become a good deal more difficult as well. It's never been easy, and we're in an especially challenging period now. It's easy to give some obvious advice, but when you scratch the surface, the advice becomes not so helpful. So things like prize substance over symbolism in how the US deals with the Taiwan question. Okay, hard to argue with that. But what's substance and what's symbol? Much of the stuff on my list you could dismiss as symbolic, but I think it's really important substantively. Maybe don't have the Speaker of the House go to Taiwan, but yeah. Should you abandon strategic ambiguity for strategic clarity? Well, I mean, you could have that argument, but the rubber really hits the road in the realm of saying we're going to keep strategic ambiguity, but how clear is it? What's the boundary between clarity and ambiguity? We want to deter China and reassure Taiwan. Well, how do you do that in a world where everything you do to reassure Taiwan seems to make China think you're being aggressive and trying to change the status quo, which leads China to do something which you then have to react to? It's not easy. We can get into that in Q&A a bit more if you want. What I want to do is just close by saying that although the challenges today are distinctive, as anyone who's read Nancy Bernkopf Tucker's writing will recognize, they are the lineal descendants of the things she wrote about in decades past. There is truth in the cliche that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And the work of excellent and careful historians like Nancy, those who think and care about policy, and in Nancy's case actually helped make policy, both by her service in government and by the fact that people who served in government listened to her, and for good reason. It is people like that, Nancy and the very few like her, whose work is of enduring value to those in the US and Taiwan, who would seek to secure any or all of the overlapping but not identical goals of Taiwan's security, the US's national interests, and it's important to add, since we're at the Woodrow Wilson Center, international peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack. It's really wonderful to have you here, and you've provided so much food for thought. There are so many points that I wish you would expand on, but
Warren disagrees.
But let me first turn to this idea of strategic clarity versus strategic ambiguity, and the role that the United States can play in ensuring stability in cross-strait relations. So what we are looking for, I believe, is reassurance from the United States. We know that what we really want is a more effective way to support Taiwan beyond rhetoric and beyond posturing. And there's been plenty of that, right? A lot of rhetoric and a lot of posturing. What boundaries can be pushed, or should they be pushed, in terms of the legal framework? Can the legal framework be reshaped so that there is greater reassurance with the ultimate goal of deterrence from China?
Yeah, so I'm not sure the lawyers are super helpful here. They're not going to give you any magic bullet, as Mao used to like to say. The way it sort of helps is that it allows you to engage in two things. One is a degree of acoustical separation. That is, the genius of the Taiwan Relations Act is it does a lot of things that China hates in terms of supporting Taiwan. But the US essentially says, hey, it's just domestic law here. And so whenever we see the U.S. doing things domestically, especially if we see it winding up in courts, the answer is we're just applying domestic law, which resonates in a way of having implications of support for Taiwan, but it doesn't cross the Rubicon of saying we're reestablishing a formal security relationship, we're reestablishing diplomatic relations. And in a way, I think China's anti-secession law is a backhanded tribute to that. It kind of does the same thing. So the U.S. says, you may see this as having foreign policy meaning and significant, but it's just us talking to ourselves and to the Taiwanese. We're not talking to the world. And the anti-secession law essentially says, hey, this is a domestic matter here. Taiwan's part of China. If they ever try to get away, we'll do something. We're not doing it yet. So it allows both sides to kind of send their signals without taking incompatible positions on the international level. The other thing that playing the international law side of the law card does is it allows you to essentially say, I'm not doing anything to upset the order as it is. It's you who's doing that. So, the U.S. can say, basically, we're just engaged in a variety of things that are perfectly permissible. They're short of formal diplomatic relations. And, China pushes back with its own interpretation about how this is violating Chinese sovereignty, but it allows both sides essentially to say, you're the one upsetting it. And I think that's probably a little better than the opposite, and allows, more importantly, each side to say, look, we're not provoking. And since I think the U.S.-China dynamic over the Taiwan question now has really taken on some of the qualities of a security dilemma. That is, each side says it's doing something to keep things the way they are, and the other side sees that as aggressive. So, the Chinese view is Taiwan's part of China, we can't let it get away, and the U.S. is trying to change it and get it away. Whereas the U.S. view is, look, we've got a status quo situation here for decades now of separate governance, and China's trying to squeeze and push toward unification. And so I think, when you've got that going, that's the real tough nut to crack. That's where the deterrence issue becomes really difficult.
Thank you. Maybe I could follow up with that on the more concrete actions that we've seen. You mentioned the fact you focused a great deal on Taiwan's international space and the formal relations. You begin with outlining some of the formal relations it has, and of course that it has 13 countries that it has formal diplomatic relationships.
Lucky 13, yeah.
13 now, because it's just lost Honduras. But when we look at the 13 countries that Taiwan counts as formal diplomatic countries, they're actually not great friends to have, right? So I'm not making any judgment.
Why are you so mean to Paraguay?
Marshall Islands, Haiti, they are sovereign countries, but when push comes to shove, should Taiwan actually face a crisis of its own, are they going to rally to its defense? I don't really think so. I might be proven wrong, but the real friends that Taiwan actually has are the informal ones, like Japan, like the United States, like Australia, and the European nations too. And it's also important to bear in mind that when Honduras actually left and turned to the PRC instead by abandoning Taiwan, there is speculation that Honduras demanded about $2.5 billion from the Taiwanese government so that it could, can essentially to buy that diplomatic relationship. So what can the United States do? You talk about the United States can only go so far to ensure that Taiwan can have these diplomatic relations. Is it worth it? What can the United States do to actually ensure that the remaining 13, including the Vatican, don't abandon it? Is it worth the United States as well to really bat for Taiwan on this?
I think it's worth trying. So, yes, you're right that the Haitian Navy is not, or the Paraguayan Navy, which I saw several months ago in Asuncion. They have a navy, actually. It's a river navy. And they have a very nice replica of Taipei 101 right behind their presidential palace, big chrome thing. So, Paraguay at least is in for the moment. But obviously, that's not going to ride to Taiwan's rescue. So what's the utility of these things? Well, there are a few things. I mean, I wouldn't really downplay the significance of the fig leaf of a transit visit. I mean, it really allows Taiwan presidents to come and go from places where they do full formal presidential state visits, and then this fig leaf of you stop off in the United States. The transit, it really does help. And, they have been among those who have pushed for Taiwan's access and inclusion in the UN and other organizations to a degree. So they're useful diplomatic allies in that way. But you're right, and I don't think anybody would deny that it really depends on the substantive support from more informal partners. Can the U.S. compel these 13 states? Probably not. I think the Taipei Act was pretty empty in that regard, but it's nice signaling. But I think you need to look at it as part of a broader package of the ways the U.S. can support Taiwan formally and informally, and can, to a degree, frame things that squeeze Taiwan as being the disruptive move. And I think the more you've got the trappings of robust informal relationships and a handful of formal relationships, the easier it is to say, look, in the security dilemma-like arrangement, it's China's trying to change the arrangement here.
Thank you. I was remiss. We are actually taking questions from our online audience. If you go to the chat box below where you see Jack's face talking right now, you can actually ask questions, and I will be able to read them on my phone as well. Before I turn to questions from the audience, if I may, have one last question. It was actually really refreshing to have a substantive conversation, talk about Taiwan without mentioning semiconductors even once. But I focus on trade and economics, and so when we look at Taiwan, we do talk a great deal about how Taiwan dominates in the advanced chip-making industry. And Taiwan itself talks about the silicon shield and the protection that it provides. How does that concept of the silicon shield kind of fit into your broader framing of informal relations that Taiwan has? And does it actually help in securing its space in the international arena?
Yeah, so one of the reasons I didn't mention it in my talk is I knew Shihoko was going to be up here afterwards. And we worked together long enough that I would have been appalled if we didn't get to TSMC eventually. So, I mean, I think it's part of the broader landscape here, which is to quote the title of a book of somebody, a distinguished lecturer who preceded me in the series, Shelley Rigger, why Taiwan matters. And there are a whole bunch of reasons Taiwan matters, and I've talked about some of them, but not all of them. And so the idea that Taiwan is now part of a security architecture where we're drawing fewer distinctions between formal treaty allies like Australia, Philippines sort of back in it, Japan, Korea, and then sort of less formal partners, including our traditional friends, the Vietnamese. But you have this sort of this array around the edges, and so Taiwan now sort of folds into that. So it matters on that front. It matters normatively, and that's what Taiwan pushes very hard for. Say it's part of this alliance of like-minded states, and of course it matters economically, and that's been it's really its strongest card in many ways for years. It currently is semiconductors, but it's been punching way above its weight as a trading state and a manufacturing, increasingly high-end manufacturing state. And I think that's part of it, and that is a good part of the reason, although by no means all of it, about why Taiwan's quest for international space on the organizational front has been with things like the WTO, the ADB, things like that. It's in areas where if you cut Taiwan out of this, the regime is profoundly incomplete.
Thank you. All right, so the floor is open. There is a microphone. If you could wait until the microphone comes to you. Mark, if we can get the gentleman, Mark Kennedy there.
Mark Kennedy with the WABA Institute of Strategic Competition here at the Wilson Center. I was intrigued by you talking about not wanting to have it be viewed as a secession. And recently, Tsai's administration has been emphasizing something that the KMT can't, that Taiwan was never ruled by China. How effective of a strategy is that?
Okay, I'm going to first, again, put on my international law nerd hat for a moment, which is that somewhere back at 45 minutes ago or so, I started with the criteria for statehood. And that's a little bit of a cheat, because although ostensibly whether you're a state or not is this kind of quasi-scientific, do you have a substantial and stable distinct population, do you have territory with clear boundaries, do you effectively govern, do you engage in international relations, and so on. That's not really a uniformly or symmetrically applied test. And I don't want to get too into law stuff, but I think if you look around the world, behavior in international politics takes those things kind of seriously. If you've gotten over the hump to being a state, you have, despite the things near the end of my talk, where the sacrosanctity of that principle is now under some stress, it's still a pretty good thing to have. And the secession issue plays to that because in theory there should be just this line, right? You're above it or below it. But as a practical matter, if you're above it, it's real hard to get dragged down below it. You know, you can take over a country for 5 years. If the old folks come back and take over again, it's still a state. If you're below it, you're inside another state and you want to break away, it takes a long time to get there. And you've really got to essentially clear a higher threshold. So that, I think, is the background to this statement of we're not seceding. We've never been ruled. We are a separate, sovereign, independent country, right? So that's always been the kind of mix. And you know, there's a lot of gray and a lot of murk, and we could go through the whole history of the evolution of the way leaders in Taiwan talk about this, from Lee Teng-hui's July '99 statement, which was a wonderfully tangled bit of verbiage, all the way up through things that suggest that somehow when nobody was looking, Taiwan became an independent state, to things that say it's never been ruled by China and therefore what? Status undetermined. There are a bunch of things you can do there, but all of those are essentially different ways of getting out of Beijing's preferred narrative, which is you are part of China, and until you secede, you're still part of China. Anybody helping you in a way that gets into essentially secession or military support for rebellion or something is therefore breaking Chinese sovereignty, right? So you really are essentially saying we're somewhere in here, we're not down there. If you're down there and you're trying to cross the threshold of independent statehood, it's really tough. You think of things like the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. Kosovo didn't have an easy time. Getting it, and it's still, although it can get into the UN, I gather, for meetings, unlike Taiwanese, it's it's very hard to get up to the level of statehood. So the system is set up. I mean, again, law isn't doing the work here, but law reflects a kind of political accommodation that says we don't like states are like matter; they shouldn't be easily created or destroyed. And so if you're seceding, you're trying to create one. If you're taking over, then you're trying to destroy one.
Okay. Thank you. See you, lady.
Hi, my name's Tara McKelvey, and I work for Radio Free Asia. I'm a writer. You talked about U.S. politics and about how they're not very subtle regarding Taiwan. I'm wondering if you can tell us about maybe some visits coming up of some of the presidential candidates and what these visits, the kind of impact that these visits have on Taiwan and also on the larger issue with the U.S. and China.
You're talking about Taiwanese presidential candidates coming to the U.S.? Is that the question?
No,
about U.S. presidential candidates.
About the U.S. presidential candidates going to Taiwan.
Going to Taiwan, okay. Well, either one is a kind of fraught enterprise. I mean, it's. I think in some ways the one that's going to be more significant is Taiwan's presidential candidates coming to the U.S. I mean, there is a. It's kind of like ancient Rome. You have to go to the imperial capital and get approved. That's obviously too snarky, but there is a ritual where they do this, and it's going to be a little interesting this time because there is no incumbent president, and Lai Ching-te as the most likely DPP nominee and the incumbent vice president is going to have restrictions on what he can do when he's here that a non-office holder or a non-national level office holder wouldn't have. But there will, there's people, candidates come here and get quizzed on how they're going to handle cross-strait relations. It went badly for Tsai in 2012. It went better on subsequent visits. So that's part of the mix. As to U.S. presidential candidates going to Taiwan, I mean, boy, how far do I want to wade out into the thin ice of American politics, which I won't claim it. So, I mean, I think if you get a situation where you've got fairly presumptive nominees, then you're not going to see those kinds of visits that mean much if there are visits at all. And I think the rest of it is, how to put it, relations between Taiwan and the United States are existential issues, defining issues. You got to pass the test or you lose issues for presidential candidates in Taiwan. For the U.S., it's part of the bundle. That it's going to move the needle on U.S. presidential politics is, of course, and that's not going to happen. Is it even going to meaningfully constrain someone or give a meaningful preview of what U.S. policy on China-Taiwan cross-strait issues would be? I doubt that it does much. I mean, there was back when American politics was a little less head-spinning than it is now. You could predict that the out-of-power party, its candidate, and its candidates before it settled on one, would bash the incumbent party for being too soft on China. And then you get to be president, and you get whacked in the head by reality, and you sort of trim a little bit. The dynamics are different now, but I think it's still not an area where campaign statements are going to translate neatly into policy.
Maybe if I could follow up on that, in a nutshell, how helpful or hurtful are high-level U.S. visits to Taiwan today?
I think it depends on the visit. I mean, I think there is a lot to be said for allowing higher level contacts that have sometimes happened in the past. That's partly symbolic, but it's also partly dysfunctional. I mean, if you are in a realm where we are talking more seriously than before about the possibility of the need for some kind of military cooperation and coordination, that requires communication channels that the folks who are much deeper in the defense world than I am say are legitimate concerns, not only just bilaterally, but with Japan and regionally. And it does sort of help with the Taiwan status issues. But this is one of those symbolism substance things. They're not just symbolic, they're also substantive. But then there are ones that are going to really push buttons. And we get into the kabuki of the Pelosi visit. Is it per se transformative if the Speaker of the House goes to Taiwan? Well, it need not be. But China put down very clear markers that it would view this as a big, big deal. And once China had made clear it was going to view it as a big, big deal, then for her to go was a thumb in the eye. And then we got into the unraveling place that we are.
Great. Thank you. Richard. Oh, if you could wait for the microphone.
Thank you, Jacques, for your excellent presentation, systematic as always. I wonder if I could push you to speculate on why China has been so relentless in trying to drive Taiwan from the international community in all the ways that you cataloged in the sort of earlier part of your talk. Does it reflect such a devotion to the facts of history and the principles of international law as China understands it? Does it reflect a new sort of imperial hubris on the part of Beijing? Or is it perhaps an element of China's strategy of how to bring about unification?
Yes. I think there are a few things there. One is that it is an important part of the strategy for avoiding permanent disunity. So I mean, Richard is the dean of the business here on this one, but we've had many conversations over the years about the difference between needing to win versus needing not to lose. And we had a very long period when all China needed was for Taiwan not to drift away. And I think the crux now has become that the view that not to unify is to drift away is I think much more the way China seems to see this. So the imperative to do something to keep the pressure on, to marginalize Taiwan, to keep others from supporting Taiwan robustly, is now based on the sort of interweaving of those 2 points in a way where there used to be more of a policy choice. So I think that's driving a lot of it. I think Xi Jinping and company have bound themselves a little bit to the mast with the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation cannot be achieved so long as there's unrecovered territory and unrecovered people. I mean, that's a little bit of a mast-binding statement that it's hard to walk away from. And I was actually just at a talk earlier today that I was supposed to be hosting at my center, but I did by Zoom, which was essentially the argument that, this is from Zhao Suisheng in his new book, which basically says, things have gotten so centralized under Xi Jinping that people in the foreign policy apparatus are going around trying to read the whims, and the signal that's coming is we cannot pass this down from generation to generation. You get more points for being a wolf warrior than for being anything else. And so even without there being sort of a fully worked out strategy behind it, those are the signals. And as you know, at least as well as I do, it's hard to turn that battleship. Once the rhetoric is in place, it would take a lot to really depart from it, and that would require a sort of big deal rethink. And I don't see signs of a big deal rethink. I mean, the first white paper on Taiwan since 2000, and the first one of the Xi Jinping era, which was dropped right after the Pelosi visit, although clearly it was being written long before that, it was pretty much the same old stuff with a couple of tweaks here and there. And so I think given that you don't see a real turn, you hear these periodic discussions about coming up with a new version of the one country, two systems policy and stuff like that. But, I'm certainly, Xi Jinping doesn't talk to me real often, right? So I don't know what's going on, but it doesn't feel like there's a major rethink. And until that happens, I think we're just, the momentum is there, but I think the thing that really drives it is where I started with this, which is the sense that not to push back and to squeeze is to risk the drifting away, and therefore you need to see some signs of progress, at least symbolically, toward unification.
So on this question of perhaps China has reached this point of no return regarding Taiwan, I have a question online from Richard Howe, who is the Executive Vice President of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, who asks, Xi Jinping has indicated that he considers Taiwan's unification with the mainland a major objective of his presidency before the end of his third term. If that is really true, is it realistic to believe that the U.S. can prevent this from happening?
I doubt that Xi Jinping has it as an agenda for before the end of his third term. That would be pretty dire. But I used to joke when Xi Jinping removed term limits, I used to joke to my friends in Taiwan, you should be grateful. If it's a legacy issue, he's now going to be there for life. So you bought yourself a couple decades. But I think the discussion of this issue in the U.S. has I think, gotten problematic, and that we're talking so much about war and actual conflict that we wind up spending less time talking about the ways about how to avoid it and manage it. And that's not an on-off switch, but it's drifted a bit in that direction. And so the thing that has come out of the discussion that is something of a consensus, and I'm not at all sure it's wrong, is that whether China acts against Taiwan militarily is not going to be based on some cold calculus of costs and benefits and likelihood of success. That if there is a go signal, it's because of a sense of existential crisis, or we stumble into it through some kind of escalatory dynamic, and that's just the framework where what can the U.S. do to prevent it becomes much more complicated. I mean, how do you send the signal that effectively deters China when we get into the security dilemma dynamic of the stronger signal you send, the more it feeds the Chinese view that we're on a collision course and nothing can be done to avoid conflicts. We may as well have it now rather than later. And another one of my predecessors of the series, Wang Jisi, it famously has written basically the Chinese mindset on this now is there's nothing you can do to fix it. And that makes deterrence really hard. Would the U.S. ride the rescue militarily? Well, I think that's been the challenge, is to make that convincing, and Biden has said it several times. There is a great deal of doubt in Taiwan about whether that would happen. The polling on that is kind of all over the map. It bounces back and forth and depends on what's happened most recently, and the Ukraine lessons on that have been really murky in Taiwan. But that's the issue. I mean, will we do it? I think I think the cheap and true answer is it depends. And if you even look at the statements by Biden that people have criticized as moving away from strategic ambiguity, they are couched in the context of an unprovoked attack. And so in a sense, it's the old position of the U.S. sits in judgment of who is responsible for any crisis in cross-strait relations and leans the other way, tries to manage the situation. It's just that's become much, much harder by the new circumstances. We've been engaged in some attempts at mass binding here, suggesting that not only this is a real U.S. commitment that Biden said, but also it's gotten this, eerily reminiscent of domino theory, perhaps. But that if we don't ride to Taiwan's defense, other allies in the region are going to doubt us, and therefore we have to be part of that matrix. I mean, there's a good deterrence theory reason for that, but it is dangerous in its own way.
Thanks. Right. Oh.
Jock, I want to echo Richard's comments on quality of your talks. I feel quite confident Nancy would have been pleased, so thank you. I have a question which may appear sort of naive, but I'm retired, so I'm entitled to be naive. I have a question about state of thinking in China on Taiwan. To a relatively unknowledgeable observer, there seems to be very little debate within China, either at the official level or just at the popular level. Is there this consensus on Taiwan? Are there factions within the party, within the government, that might have somewhat different picture? And if the consensus is as broad as it appears to be, does this create dangers such as those that you hinted at just a minute ago? 2027 comes, President Xi has raised expectations for what might happen. he is not necessarily prepared to embark upon a military adventure, and yet this general consensus says we have no choice. So do you worry about something like that, assuming there is a consensus?
So not too many years ago, it was common to talk about different factions, different opinion groups on Taiwan policy in China. And the joke that used to go around mainland Taiwan policy circles was there were three factions. In Beijing, there was the war faction. In Shanghai, there was a peace faction. And in Fujian, there was a surrender faction. Basically, there was this rage. And you could see that if you go to meetings at Xiamen University, or you go to the thing that is ostensibly part of CAS, that is the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, that is their Taiwan Research Institute. I mean, you get different views, and Shanghai had its own. I assume there are still different views, but they're darn hard to see. There's less space for that kind of discussion in the Xi era. I don't get there these days. I've been there since pre-COVID, so to the extent people are still willing to talk, I don't have the opportunity to talk to them. People are starting to go back up. I haven't heard any great reports on that. And I think a lot of the people that people like us used to talk to don't really, and can still talk to, may not have the kind of influence they used to have. I mean, I think there's been this sort of narrowing of inputs. So I'm sure the views are there. How influential they are and how much diversity of view, I don't really know. I think there's not much space for expressing it. As to whether there is this kind of, has Xi bound himself to the mast domestically by saying this? Absent things getting a lot shakier in Chinese domestic politics than they look to be, I wouldn't think so. I remember once being, tell a quick war story, once being at a meeting with somebody who was a retired, very senior official in the Taiwan Affairs office. And it was a group of academics talking about Taiwan issues, Chinese academics, when there was more room for this kind of debate. And somebody, a relatively junior guy, was making the argument of the nationalist fervor here is such that we have to move on Taiwan and we have to push back against the US on this. This is about 10 years ago. And this senior retired guy said, "We don't follow public opinion, we make public opinion." Now, that's obviously an oversimplification in the other direction, but I think there's still a lot of latitude to move there. I mean, look what Xi Jinping got away with on zero COVID. I mean, in many ways, that was a disastrous policy, but he doesn't seem to have been shaken profoundly by it. I think the bigger worries are either things get unstable and then, I'm not to say diversionary war, I think that's basically nonsense, but things get unstable and therefore get unpredictable. I don't think bringing an irresponsible leader in Taiwan, but it's not inconceivable that could add some volatility. The paranoia du jour, which I think may be another overdrawn analogy, is how many steps down the Putin road has Xi gone? I think not many. But there's still enough things there. What if he's getting bad information about just how capable the PLA is of doing this and that sort of thing? And so I wouldn't weight any of those as real high probabilities, but they're all things to lose a little sleep over.
Bonnie.
Thank you, Jacques, for a terrific talk. So you mentioned the Taiwan version of one country, two systems. And of course, Xi Jinping raised that in his January 2019 speech. And it did stimulate, not surprisingly, as when he launched, the Idailu in 2013, everybody started studying it. And the Taiwan research community in China has spent the last few years investigating what a Taiwan version of one country, two systems would look like. And my sense from talking to Chinese researchers who have visited recently is that they're making some progress. They're not talking about how we get from here to there. The assumption is reunification has taken place, and then how do we govern Taiwan? And a lot of that, of course, is applying Chinese law to Taiwan. And we, of course, saw how they did this with Hong Kong, and with Taiwan it will be very different. There has been discussion about passing a national reunification law in Beijing. We haven't seen that yet. But I'm curious if maybe you could just think through a bit, maybe speculate what you think this use of sort of even like lawfare in trying to come up with some one country, two systems version for Taiwan. Should we be worried about this? Should Taiwan be worried about this? Or is this primarily something that is really for domestic purposes inside China, and it feeds the beast for those people who are demand that they do something in order to advance reunification?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're right, the power of tropes, right? So as soon as Xi Jinping said, "Yi Dai Lu," everything is bundled. It's like everything's belt and road, right? It's kind of like in the U.S. In the post 9/11 thing. If any report you wanted read, you put "and the global war on terror." So how much you take this label. But so I think there are a couple things going on, and this is mostly speculation. I mean, I think we both have a sense that there's nothing super concrete that's come out, at least that's visible to us, about what that would look like. Yeah, well, it's possible. So, I mean, I think one thing that set that off is not just that the signal that we can talk about what a Taiwanese version of one country, two systems, that's not new. I mean, after all, the provision in the Chinese constitution that provided for special administrative regions was initially drafted with Taiwan in mind, got applied to Hong Kong because of the British weird hyper-legalism. Oh, our lease is about to run out. We better solve this. And so Hong Kong got moved to the front of the queue. But it was always a Taiwan design thing, and it was always supposed to be different. I mean, even Macau and Hong Kong aren't quite identical. They're really close. And the early days, it was a much more capacious one for Taiwan, right? So you can keep your military, all these sorts of things. And that doesn't seem to be in the mix. So I think some of what is driving the boomlet is that, and here I agree with what Richard Nuzzo said, that the new white paper, the 22 white paper, does not really change the dynamic, but one of the shifts in tone is it is more when we do this rather than this will happen. And I think that means once you say when we do this, that conversation gets going. I think some of it also was they had to come up with a new model because last time I checked is what they did in Hong Kong that guaranteed Tsai Ing-wen a second term. It's not a model that's real popular, so you need a different model unless you're going to have people run for the exits in one form or another. But it's I think something that there is clearly serious discussion going on about. There is a lawfare element to it. That is, the more you normalize the idea of we are drafting law to govern this part of China, then the more it sort of gets folded into, yes, there's lots of domestic legal diversity, and there's special rules for the minority areas, there's special rules for the SARs, and you start sort of trying to do this fait accompli of here's a bunch of laws for Taiwan. It's playing in a way the same kind of game that you see Taiwan playing talking about how it's completely separate in governance and all that. So I think that's part of it. The national reunification law, I mean, that would be a boneheaded move, so I hope they don't do it. Because the beauty of the anti-secession law was that it was conceptually aggressive and practically patient. Right, so it said Taiwan is part of China. It hasn't gotten away, but if it ever tries, there's going to be hell to pay. National reunification law says, oh, Taiwan did get away. Damn, we better fix that. And then the clock starts ticking. But I think the same thing, and this is part of the answer to Richard's question, the same thing that has this sort of sense of we better make some progress at some point. Well, if you really think the dynamic is we better start making some progress, you better have a plan. What happens after Saddam falls? What happens after you got to have a plan for governing, and I think it just feeds back into that. But I think the lawfare part of it is to normalize it, to make it look like it's just ordinary domestic stuff. The substantive part of it is, I think it's, I don't imagine how you can ever sell this in Taiwan, but you sure as heck can't sell one country, two systems if the idea in everybody's head is post-national security law Hong Kong. I think it's got below zero popularity if that's possible.
Yes, Lisa.
Thank you for a terrific speech. My name is Ken Scabe, Marine Corporation. So I would like to ask about the hypothetical shift from the strategical ambiguity to strategical clarity. So do you think to what extent the US government could concretely push the clarity in the way which won't lead China to give up the peaceful unification policy and make the mind to invade Taiwan immediately? And on the other hand, the US government successfully ensured Taiwan people or government that the US absolutely stand for them. So obviously the president saying that 4 times were not enough, right? So how would the strategic clarity looks like? And by the way, I'm also always wonder if the term strategic ambiguity is the U.S. official word or not. And if such a strategic shift occur, will it be very obvious style? I mean, the obvious statement from the U.S. government, or just very ambiguity shift to strategic clarity?
Okay. So I think yes, as you know, there's been a lot of discussion, should we abandon strategic ambiguity for strategic clarity? That strikes me as one of the things that's in the bucket of symbolic stuff that is best not messed with. What would it really mean? Just changing the label without a radical change or a significant change in policy would just be provocative to no good end. I don't think it would really reassure Taiwan particularly, and I think it would be a real pushback point for China. And so the whole point of strategic ambiguity is basically how to get the incentives right. And so that means not writing a blank check for Taiwan, right? So that there's an entrapment dynamic of Taiwan does something reckless because it thinks the US will ride to the rescue no matter what it does. I think that risk is pretty low right now and doesn't drive policy. The alternative, the other side of it though, is to deter China. But if you want to deter China, you of course want to make credible commitments about how the US with its allies and partners will exact costs if China does move. And that has led to a lot of the ratcheting up, and that gets us back into that security dilemma dynamic that I was talking about. But the trouble is that given the doubts in Taiwan about the reliability of US support, that creates an incentive to signal ever more reassurance at the same time that then China sees that as proof that there is no assurance side of deterrence to China. That is, there's nothing China can do to keep things from being a train wreck. So I think that's what's really driving this. And the switch from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity, China's going to take that as deep proof that there's nothing they can do that will reduce enmity and the likelihood of conflict with the US. And it would just be seen as a red flag. So the real challenge is sort of how you ratchet up, how you sort of go clear in the sense of the areas where the U.S. will take some degree of action. But I think, rambling a little bit here, but I think the problem is strategic ambiguity, strategic clarity too often gets discussed as when will you actually send in the military, right? And it's not that. It's degrees of support over degrees of scenario, and it's a very nuanced, very sort of complex, multi-stranded things, except at the poles. So at one extreme pole, if Taiwan clearly provokes a crisis where the U.S. is saying don't do that, don't do that, don't do that, or if China does a flat-out military attack without any reason other than Xi Jinping's decided it's go time. Everything else in between, you've really got to look case by case, and I think trying to put it under a simple label is going to be tough. And the genius of strategic ambiguity, like the genius of the Taiwan Relations Act, is it allows for flexibility and adaptation in ways that don't create a lot of tripwires and landmines where somebody feels utterly compelled to respond.
So I have one last question. It's online from Tom Gold at Berkeley.
Hey, Tom.
Yeah. He asks, is there any evidence of Beijing's reaction to opinion polls conducted primarily by National Tsinghua University on identity and attitudes towards unification?
I'm sure they read those polls. I've talked with Chinese sort of policy-connected scholars over the years about that sort of thing. So I don't know how much of it's filtering into Xi Jinping's mindset, but they've got to know that what has happened, and Shelley Rigger did a wonderful piece on this several years ago, is there's been a disconnect. That is, for a long time, if you identified as Taiwanese, you were pro-independence, a little bit of an oversimplification. But as Taiwanese identity has gone up and up, support for formal independence has become decoupled from that. And they've got to be aware of that. What they make of it, I'm not really sure. But I think it should be. Well, back to I guess the colloquy with Richard. It should be reassuring if your goal is not to lose. It's terrifying if your goal is to bring them fully back into the fold. And so, which side of that coin are we looking at?
Great. Well, the time has come for us to thank you, Jacques, for a really great discussion. Taiwan is very much in the headlines these days, but I think this has been a great opportunity to really think through and talk more I don't want to say strategically, more fundamentally about what U.S. interests are, and perhaps more importantly, what Taiwan's interests are with the United States and the bilateral relations moving forward. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to those who have been able to join us today online. This lecture will actually be posted online together with the 8 other lectures that we have had over the years. So with that, I would like to also, I would be remiss if I did not thank Warren Cohen for having the confidence and the faith in the Wilson Center and the Asia program in particular to be able to remember Nancy in a way that celebrates her work and her life achievements. So thank you so much. With that, I would like to invite you all to join us across the hallway for light refreshments, including wine and beer. So thank you.
Thank you so much.